Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Shiloh. I am a community health case manager here at Neighborhood House, and I'm also a member and co-facilitator of both the multicultural and multi-ethnic affinity group and the unapologetically Black affinity group. I'd like to get started by reading our Neighborhood House land acknowledgement, which was written and developed by our Indigenous, Native American, Alaska Native, Hawaiian Pacific Islander affinity group. A land acknowledgement is a simple and powerful way to correct the stories and practices that erase Indigenous people's history and culture. Indigenous can include Native Americans, Alaskan Natives, American Indians, First Nations, and others. Neighborhood House recognizes that we are on Indigenous lands, specifically the lands of Coast Salish people. We offer acknowledgement to our Coast Salish relatives and cultures, including the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Snoqualmie, the Muckleshoot, and many other Lushootseed speaking communities and people. We recognize that we serve communities on lands governed by the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliott, a treaty that has not been fully honored. Neighborhood House also recognizes that we serve Indigenous people who are in King County due to forced relocation from their traditional homelands, and that many of our resources come from sources that have created inequities for Indigenous people.
Thank you, Jasmine. My name is Rika Washington, and I'm a housing stability case manager and a co-facilitator of Neighborhood House's Unapologetically Black Affinity Group. I do want to start with letting you know that this will be streaming on, it will be recorded and streaming on Facebook Live. Your cameras and mics will be turned off during the presentation. The Q&A chat box is available to submit any anonymous questions, and we will do our best to get them to our speaker if time permits. Please do not put any personal or confidential information and keep the questions appropriate. We will send a follow-up email to everyone with any resources shared and any links and a link to the recording, excuse me. In addition, our session today will be interpreted in American Sign Language by Cheryl and Lisa. Thank you both. Neighborhood House was started in 1906 by the National Council of Jewish Women. This marks our 115th year anniversary. We became an independent nonprofit in the 1950s and now operate at over 30 sites across King County. Our mission is to build community and increase access to housing, health, education, and economic opportunity. We serve 16,000 clients per year. 90% of those clients are BIPOC, and over half are immigrants and refugees speaking over 70 different languages. We hope these virtual events are opportunities to engage and learn more about Neighborhood House, our community, and how to grow together to achieve our vision of a healthy, diverse, and welcoming community free of poverty and racism, where all people will thrive. I'd like to introduce our moderators for the series today. Angel Berry, her pronouns are she, her. She's the lead youth advocate within the Youth and Family Services Program, known as our Project Scope here at Neighborhood House. Davon Fumby, pronouns he, his, as a sophomore at Mount Rainier High School. He's eager to learn more about his community in hopes of pursuing a degree in social work after high school. Thich Nhi Va, pronouns she, her, is a peer educator at Neighborhood House and a student at Western Washington University. And of course, our special guest speaker today, Ijeoma Oluo. Her pronouns are she, her. Miss Oluo is a writer, speaker, and internet yeller. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, So You Want to Talk About Race, and most recently, Mediocre, The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America. Her work on race has been featured in The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Washington Post, among many other publications. She was named to the 2021 Time 100 Next list and has twice been named to the Root 100. She received the 2018 Feminist Humanist Award and the 2020 Harvard Humanist of the Year Award from the American Humanist Association. She lives in Seattle, Washington. We welcome you, and I will pass off the mic to Twitney.
Hi. So my first kind of question is about COVID from this past year. I've noticed that so many of my peers are engaging themselves in conversations around race, equity, and social justice. But as we continue to participate in these important conversations, there is a sense of burnout. And so how do you suggest we keep others and ourselves engaged in productive conversations around equitable recovery, systemic racism, and et cetera?
There's a couple of things. One, I would say it's important to recognize that we don't all have the same role in combating systemic oppression. And I think that's vital. A lot of times, traditionally, it's been the idea that we are the educators, that BIPOC populations are the educators, especially Black populations, and that white people are there to learn and then perhaps change themselves. So I'm going to challenge a couple of things around that. One, that it's not an eat, pray, love journey to becoming an anti-racist. What we're looking at is right now is systems and how we can deconstruct them. And when we do that, it's important to recognize what it is that's happening with these systems. These systems are a fundamental devaluing and exploitation of the lives and bodies of populations of color, right? So in that, our actions must always affirm the real truth, which is that we have fundamental value, inherent value that cannot be taken away. And that means that when we're doing this work, it always has to be systems focused. We have to be looking and saying, does this actually improve? Does this heal the harm being done to populations of color? Does it stop harm from being done to populations of color? If it doesn't, toss it aside. And so what that means is that if you are a person of color, first and foremost, your number one job is caring for yourself and your community, because no one will step in and do that work. And it is important when we're counteracting this idea that we don't have value, that we don't fall down this really harmful rabbit hole that says that we are martyrs, because that in itself is undermining our value. So look first and say, what's going to keep me going? What's going to keep my family going? And know that that's not a rest. It's not a break. It's not a break from the work. That is the work itself. Work itself is waking up every day and recognizing your value and the value of your community. And then for white people and people with white skin privilege, I would say it's really vital to look and say, can people of color actually feel what I'm doing right now in a real way that matters? And so that means, you know, when your Facebook post, does it actually impact their day? No. Does it impact how they move through systems? No. How you spend your money might, how you vote might, you know, the important conversations you're having with people in power might, right? But that's really where you need to focus. And I would say it's really important that we remember this. We are fighting for our communities. So if we aren't caring for our communities and they are lost in this struggle, we've lost the struggle. Even if we tear white supremacy apart, if we're not left standing and whole and healthy, we haven't won. And so I always try to remember I need to be spending at least as much time giving to my community, enriching my community, as I spend fighting these systems themselves. And if that means I have to cut back on the fight and say, hey, you know what, actually, you have more power in this system. You do this while I do this. Then that's important, because the truth is that these battles are never going to stop coming. You know, 2020 was hard on so many people. 2021 is also hard on so many people. 2022 is going to be hard too. And so is every year after that. And this idea that we can do the work now and rest later has been proven to be untrue for over 400 years of history of this country. We have to find the rest, we have to find the care now, and we have to make time for that, because no one else is going to give it to us.
Yeah, thank you for that response. That really resonated, this whole discussion around self-care, especially in having these hard conversations. I kind of had a follow-up specifically on that question regarding just how some people are open to discussing and working actively, and then others aren't. So how do we kind of normalize the uncomfortableness that people are experiencing with having these hard conversations and doing the work around race, equity, and social justice?
You know, one thing I always try to do when I'm giving talks, you know, I would love it if we had a world where we would just only be able to interact with the people who are ready to interact with us. And I think sometimes it's fine to actually say, you know what, you're not there, and I'm going to focus on people who are and do the work. There is nothing wrong with that. And I actually think as a society, we spend too much time, and part of this is white supremacy, the thought that no white person is irredeemable. So let's focus on the toughest case first. And if we spend a year trying to win over this virulent racist, it's worth our time. No, it's not. Your time is worth more than that, you know? And so I think it's important for us to know that. Like, if people make it clear they are not interested, your time is worth more than that. Move on. Because there are people who are interested and don't know where to start. Now, that being said, there are plenty of people who will tell you that they think racism is wrong, that they wish they could do something, but they don't necessarily, they're not ready. They don't know how these conversations are going to go, and they're afraid, right? So what I always like to do when I'm in those, when I'm feeling like having those generous conversations, and they are generous, is starting with a statement of faith based in the fundamental truth that people can handle hearing hard things. And that's something that we have to make really clear. If you are a white person or a person with skin color privilege, you can handle hearing about how awful our systems are. You can handle hearing about how you've been complicit. You can handle hearing about harm you've done. It will not kill you. You will not fall apart. You will be able to handle it, absorb it, learn from it, and do better. How do I know this? Because we're living it. We're living it and working and running through this world. We're dealing with it on such a deep level. You are strong enough and you can do that. So when I start conversations, a lot of times what I try to think of is, when this person gets on the other side of this, right? When they get past their discomfort, past the white supremacist impulse to center their feelings above the humanity of people of color, when they learn and grow and start to do better, what does our relationship look like? How do they move through the world? How do they interact with me? Think about what that looks like, you know, based on experiences with people who may be there in your life. And then offer that to people. So if you're doing this, say in a workspace, a lot of times I tell people, think about it. If your boss actually got it, if your peers got it, how would you work together? How would you move through the day? What problems would be solved and solvable? You know, what kind of relationship would you have? Take that image, offer it to the person you're talking to, and say, this is what I think we're capable of. I think you can get here. But in order to get here, we're going to have to do some of this hard and painful work of having honest, real conversations. And sometimes giving someone that vision, because I really do believe that one of the, you know, foundations of white supremacy is lack of imagination. Sometimes giving people that piece to imagine a new reality that's very possible is what they need to move forward with a little less fear. Because a lot of times, the way in which we've structured our conversations around racism is the idea that once you've been found to be racist, then you might as well just go and pop yourself in the garbage can because you are a monster and a Klan member and no one will ever deal with you again. And the truth is that we live in a system that makes it almost impossible to not move forward with racist beliefs and actions. And that system was built by people. It can be taken down by people. And just like we learn these harmful behaviors and ideas, we can learn new, less harmful behaviors and ideas. And so I think offering that to someone and then saying, are you willing? Do you want this? And asking them, is this what you want? And sometimes you will hear, no, it's not what I want. I don't want to do that work. And then you know, and then you can move on. And you know, like that is not someone you can work with or deal with, and it's clear. But a lot of times what you hear from people is, oh, okay, you're investing in me and you think I can do this. Maybe I can do this. And it also gives you an agreed upon goal that you can pull conversations back to when they get tough, because conversations are still going to get tough and messy. And you can say, wait a minute, remember, this is what we're building towards. And I think it's still worth it.
Thank you so much for your response. And I'm gonna pass it off to Devon.
Hi, my name is Devon. First, before I ask my question, I'll say thank you for letting me get the opportunity to speak to you. And my question was, how was your experience as a woman of color growing up in Washington impacts your access to opportunities, and how would you do it?
That's a great question, Devon. It is weird growing up as a Black woman in the Seattle area. And I would say, there's a difference. If you've lived in Seattle a while, you'll notice there's a lot of people who didn't grow up here. A lot of people come in from different industries. When I meet Black people who grew up here, it is a different type of person I'm meeting than someone who came up elsewhere. Because this is a city of wealth and comfort. And not only are there very few Black people here, but the people who are trapped in poverty are more likely to be Black and other populations of color. And they're made invisible by the extreme wealth and comfort in this space. So if you come, I've been to spaces where you have a lot of people who are in your same financial situation, where you have whole neighborhoods and areas where like people understand this struggle, where you can be more politically active and heard. That doesn't really exist in Seattle, or hasn't existed up until now. We've, of course, had like the Central District, which is rapidly disappearing. But usually populations of color and poor populations have been in little tiny pockets spread throughout this comfortable white majority. What that means is, like, for me growing up, as a poor Black kid in a poor family of color, I was constantly made invisible. Systems were never built to serve me. I remember being kicked out of advanced opportunities in school because I didn't have a phone, and I didn't have steady electricity, and it was impacting my ability to do work. And no one thought to make resources available to me, because the thought that I wouldn't have a phone, that I wouldn't have steady electricity, that I wouldn't have a safe place to study at night was not something that my school considered for any kids, right? And so it was very tough. And it's also a place that the racism was always going to be hidden in the systems. It's always going to be silently acted upon you. Of course, I've been called names and things like that, but usually it's just, oh, you don't exist in these spaces. You don't exist in these systems. So for me, how it's impacted my life and my work, it means I had to become incredibly observant. People weren't going to walk up to me and say, I'm treating you this way because you're Black. I had to figure out what wasn't being said. And I do think in some ways it's why I'm the writer that I am, because I grew up in a space where no one wanted to say the thing. No one wanted to have these conversations, where I had to watch for patterns of behavior. I had to figure out how these systems worked, because no one was going to explain it to me. And I've used that in my writing. I wouldn't say it's worth it. I think this idea of like, our hardships make us who we are. I don't think so. I think that we become who we are in whatever situation we are in, and we use whatever situation we are in as part of our growth. And I could have been an amazing person who had less crap to deal with growing up, and that would have been lovely, but I am proud to be able to channel it in this way. And I think we all have opportunities to channel what we've been through, even if we shouldn't have had to go through them. And so I do think that there is a specific way of existing in the world if you are a person of color living in these comfortable, politically liberal, majority white areas like Seattle. And Seattle, I think, is one of the foremost examples of that. But you'll see it in Portland, you'll see it in the Bay, you'll see it in a lot of areas in New York, you'll see it in a lot of spaces like this. And it's important that we recognize that when we're talking about racism and virulent, violent racism, we are not just talking about the South. We're not just talking about Kansas City. When we talk about people being forgotten by our systems, We are not just talking about areas where the sheriffs are going to be saying something racist on television. We are absolutely talking about areas like this. But I will also say that what got me through, what got me where I am today, is my community. Like the community, the Black community in Seattle, the community of color in Seattle is really small, but the opposite of Seattle freeze. You know, it's the recognizing that for generations we have gotten through together, and every, you know, opportunity in my career came from people passing my name around and giving me recommendations, people volunteering to read early essays of mine that I'm not sure were ready for publication, you know. And being a part of that and being able to give back to that means a ton to me. So stay close to your community, stay tight with your community, stay connected, because that's going to keep your soul in a space that really wants you to feel like you make it or break it on your own. And that's absolutely never been true for Black America. It's never been true for communities of color around the world. And it won't be true for us in the future.
Thank you so much. It helped me a lot. And I will pass it on to Angel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the questions. And thank you so much, Ijeoma, for being willing to come and to be open with us. I actually have a follow-up to Devon's question for you. So you talked about how growing up in the Seattle area and how racism exists, but just on a more small, well, not smaller scale, still on a bigger scale, but it's more sneaky in a way. Now that you are on a bigger platform and you've been, you know, you've experienced life at a different degree than you did growing up, do you still experience racism the same, or do you think it's more hidden, or do you think because you have a bigger platform that people now accept you more because you're a Black woman, given the climate that, you know, a lot of people are talking about Black Lives Matter, people are talking about, you know, equity and inclusion. Do you feel like you still experience racism on the same level, or do you feel like it's shifted a little bit?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say it's a real mix. So any time your voice shows up in spaces that whiteness doesn't expect you to be, you're going to have a backlash. So I would say I absolutely experienced different types of racism I didn't face daily. Like, you know, before, when I was working in marketing, I wasn't getting emails of people telling me they hope I die. You know, like that just wasn't happening. You know, I wasn't getting threatened. I wasn't getting, you know, our home wasn't getting swatted. Like, we weren't having to take those precautions of violent threats to our home. But, and some of the day-to-day realities are the same, right? I still don't want to get pulled over by police. You know, I still worry, you know, I'm still just, you know, as likely to face violence in that sort of sense, walking down the street, getting pulled over. But one really big difference is class privilege and the privilege of platform in dealing with racism as it happens. So when I think about the times that I have lately in the last few years come across, you know, even when we were swatted, when we were targeted in our home, and officers with guns were sent to our house, my ability to have platform and speak out and say this happened to me means the response I got from the systems and authorities was vastly different than if I had been a Black woman of, you know, who's nobody knew my name, calling the police and saying I'm being targeted, right? The response would have been completely different if I didn't have that privilege and those relationships. So I would say, you know, and times like that where someone will come after me when I get banned from Facebook, right? It ends up being a news story instead of me just being banned from Facebook. So I would say the racism isn't different. And even with people who like my work, people who say, oh, I love your work, white people who come up to me, they still come up to me with the same kind of often patronizing behavior that they came to me when they liked the way I presented in meetings. You know, like it's still very similar, like, oh, you're good at this, you know, and I will use you for this and look good next to you, but I'm not actually going to take this to heart. you're still not actually a whole human being. People come up to me regularly to tell me horror stories of racism they saw white people, not thinking that I'm a person who's impacted by these stories, right? Like there's still this thought that I'm not a whole human out there. But the difference is when I tell them, hey, that's messed up, they have to hear it in a way they didn't before. They can't dismiss me. I can't get fired, those are the sort, and so I would say it's not the racism. The racism itself is the same. If anything, sometimes feels a lot more prevalent because I am a public figure, but my general sense of having resources to navigate it once it's happened is huge. I know people who are regularly targeted in their work because of the color of their skin, and they're working in factories. And they can't speak out because they will lose their ability to feed themselves and their family. I am regularly targeted. I can speak out, and it's literally my job. And I think that's really where the difference lies, is the amount of resources made available to me. But I still absolutely move through the world as a Black woman, but just a Black woman with a lot more resources. And that's not something I take lightly, because I wouldn't be able to do this work if I didn't have it. It would be too much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now I'm gonna pass it back to Twitney.
I was able to ask my second question the first time, so Davon, you can ask your second
sorry.
one. No, it's okay.
Oh, thank you. My second question was, who was there to support you in your writing journey?
That's a great question. It was mostly other women and femmes when I first started writing that supported me. I was really afraid. It's really scary to put your words out there in the world. I didn't start writing till I was in my 30s. And I remember the first time I ever had a piece that was going to be published somewhere, bawling. Like I had a whole panic attack. I was like, I can't believe I'm doing this. This is maybe the worst mistake I've ever made in my life. Like I was so dramatic about it, thinking everyone's going to hate it. Everyone's going to tell me I'm a horrible writer. And just other women and other femmes really holding me up and telling me, this is a good piece. I really like the way you wrote this. Maybe fix this sentence or fix this piece, gave me the confidence to keep going. And then it was just other Black people in the Seattle arts community. I started writing, casually, kind of in a time when we still had a lot more creatives kind of my age in the area. A lot of people ended up leaving because they couldn't afford to stay here anymore. But we would have little meetups and talk and, share ideas. And that was really, really helpful. And then also my sister-in-law is a writer, which helped a lot. I could reach out to her and ask her questions. My brother was really supportive. And then my partner has been amazing, especially with this last book. Writing a book is really, really stressful and horrible. And you get towards these due dates and you haven't slept. There were weeks where I was staying up till 4 or 5 in the morning, writing and researching. And I'm not writing about pleasant things. So it's also really draining on the soul. And just having someone who insisted on staying up with me, bringing me snacks, keeping the kids out of my room, all these things that are really necessary, meant a lot. But I would say it's so important to stay connected to community. And then also as your career grows, to keep giving back. So now, I'm someone who tries to read other people's first books and, with what I can with the time I have to keep people connected to things like that. And, but that's really how I get by. There was a lot I had to learn on the fly because I don't have a journalism degree or English degree or anything like that. My degree is in political science. So I didn't know how to send a story idea to an editor. I didn't know how to reach out to an editor. I didn't know what any of these editing terms meant. I had no idea how to start an opening of an essay or the end of an essay. And those were all things I had to find people where I could feel comfortable saying, hey, I don't know what this means, and not feel embarrassed. And I think we have to remember that a lot of times race and gender will impact your access to these everyday things that make it seem like you should be in a space or you shouldn't. And when it comes to writing, most people who have regular writing jobs, especially at magazines or papers, their parents introduced them to someone, or they got the right degrees and the right internships, all these things that, like, if you're a single parent, a Black woman, you can't quit your job and do an internship, you do all these things. And so recognizing that it's not silly and it's not embarrassing to not know these things. It's fine to ask, and no one has the right to make you feel bad about it. Just because you don't know what they are doesn't mean you don't have the right to be in that space. Was something I had to really learn. And it's something that I try to practice with other people. And so I'm always trying to be really honest and open and accepting when someone comes to me with what seems like no knowledge of how the industry works, because that's really where I was in my 30s, trying to figure out how to get things published.
Thank you so much for answering my questions. And if Angel would like to ask her second question.
I would. Thank you, Davon. So my second question, I just kind of wanted just to pick your brain a little bit. So I know that last month, President Joe Biden had passed the legislation. Well, so Juneteenth has become a federal holiday. And so just from the different types of circles that I've been in and just from reading different things on social media, I see a lot of Black people, the Black community, I see there's a lot of mixed emotions around that. A lot of people say, yeah, that's a great thing, that, it's been finally recognized after all this time. And then I see other people saying that they don't feel like it's enough, or that they feel like it's just America's way of trying to profit off of the Black experience. Because I've seen people say, like, next year you'll see a lot of sales at Walmart or Target or whoever, half off of their pre-oral for, Juneteenth. And so I guess I was just wondering, like, what do you think? What do you think about the whole idea of making it a federal holiday? Do you think it's a step up, or do you think it's keeping it stagnant, or do you think it's not a good thing?
Here's what I would say about this. I would first want to recognize, it was a Black woman behind that pushed for many years to get Juneteenth turned into a holiday. I don't want to erase that at all, because I think that's important, and I'm so happy for her, and and for everyone else who worked on that in the Black community. But I will say this: symbolism only matters when it symbolizes something that you're working towards or something that's happened. So the symbolism of Juneteenth to the Black community, especially for descendants of slaves, which I am not, so let me be really clear, I'm speaking as someone who isn't, it symbolizes actual survival and community and the beauty of that. What does that mean on a federal level? What does that mean when the actual oppressor is taking on that holiday? What does it symbolize? And that's the question we need to ask. Do I think that in itself it's harmful to have that holiday? No, I think it does nothing and could be harmful as a distraction if it doesn't symbolize what the federal government is willing to do or is working on, right? And I think that that is really, really, really important. I think it's also important to recognize, and part of where I get where people are saying this could be harmful, is federal holidays where you have people federal employees taking days off work is a financial decision. So that is, we're talking federal dollars saying we're going to close up for the day, right? That's money. So what could that money be doing other than giving the majority white people off the day off? That's a question I think that is really, really vital, right? So when we look at what people are willing to do, what systems are willing to do, I think one of the most important things to look at is where their resources are willing to go. And if you're willing to take money that could be going to securing housing, could be going to infrastructure in Black communities, could be going towards reparations and say, you know what, how about every year we just give a majority white workforce the day off? I think that it's not the holiday itself, but it's the way in which it's being executed. It says about the priorities of the federal government. And so it is vital that we don't let that distract us. So we don't spend time fighting it. I don't even think we need to spend time debating about Juneteenth as a federal holiday itself. Let it continue to mean for our communities what it has always meant. And then continue to say, this, we're not fools. And we still want this done. We still want to see actual real change. And so I think that that's really important. And it's important that our white allies recognize that supporting this or being excited about this means nothing. Like I always tell people, this doesn't raise my credit score, right? I can't eat it, I can't taste it, I can't, feel it. Therefore, it doesn't mean anything to me. So if you want to come to me and be like, oh, Juneteenth, okay, like, what are you planning on doing to make this day important, to make it something that we can feel? And that's really the questions that we need to be having. But I don't, I don't begrudge people, Black people, who are happy about this. I think we can recognize that, the work of decades of work that a Black woman has put into this, congratulate her, and still say that the government owes Black America so much more.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that question for me. um, that was my second and last question. Rico, is there another question, Dr. Earl?
Whitney has some questions that she's going to answer. A lot of good questions are coming through Q&A, so we'll get to them as fast as possible.
Yeah, the first question from the Q&A is, what are some of the things that young BIPOC can do to be in positions of power to make change and build the future they want to see?
That's such a great question. One thing I think it's really important is to recognize that systems can be various sizes and various places. So a lot of times we talk to young people as if they're going to grow up into systems and not like they're in systems right now. So it's really important to recognize the systems you're in. Your peer groups are a system. Your family is a system. Your neighborhood is a system. Your school is a system. Your sports teams are a system. It's really important to look at that and say, what is the racial dynamic right now in these systems that I'm in and I actually have some power in? What's the power dynamic right now? And look at that and recognize that you can change that system now. That you can get together with your peers and say, hey, you know what? We're not going to say this crap anymore that perpetuates racism or sexism or transmisogyny. Or we're going to start challenging what's in the textbooks that we're seeing in my classrooms. We're going to start asking questions about this and knowing that we have the right to be fully represented in our classroom and in our studies. It's important to look at these things and say, you know what, I can actually have this conversation with my family. I have the right to, shape the way my family dynamic works. This is a system I'm in as well. So look at that and start practicing, because the systems that we are in are just bigger versions. As we get older, they get bigger, but they still exist. And you don't just turn 18 and suddenly know how to change a system. So do it now. It's also really important too, because if you can change the systems you're in as a young person, to whatever extent you can, you also change the expectations for your peers. And this means that you have other young people in your classrooms, your other friends, who are going to grow up and age into voting and spending money and things like that, expecting the sort of inclusive, empowered dynamics that you've helped create in your peer groups. So practice that then. So I would say, pick something, like even, I have two sons, one is 20, one is 13. And the work they've been doing within their systems, my 13-year-old, when he was in, I think, 3rd grade or 4th grade, helped petition to change the name of one of the school buildings after Edwin Pratt, an activist here in the Northern Seattle area, right? And he would show up, he learned how to go to school board meetings with his friends and show up and get signatures and talk in front of the school board to make these important changes. He's learned how to petition the principal when he felt like the food and drink selections at the school were racially biased against students of color, and to try to get changes there, right? That system matters. And it matters too, not only because he needs to feel like he can make those changes, but because those are messages every day that say you don't exist and you don't matter, that the school is sending to all students of color, right? So the changes there, are important. And, for my older son, it was, getting together for protests, supporting queer and trans teachers was really vital for him, and making changes in classrooms that had racist curriculum. So finding that, learning that, finding out teachers and other adult figures who can support you and maybe give guidance is also really important. Teachers who and other adults who say they care about these things, it's important to recognize that you can always expect that must lead to action for it to be real. So someone saying I care about you and Black Lives Matter and blah, blah, blah doesn't mean anything if they aren't going to be there to support you when you want something done. And so you actually, even as a young person, have the right to go to that teacher and say, this is an issue that's happening. And since you said you support Black lives, since you said that you want an inclusive classroom, I would really like your support in this work. And if they don't give it, then you know that that's not real. But know that you have every right to do that. And so activate, your peers, activate adults, and try to create the world you want to see as an adult now for you as a young person.
Yeah, thank you. And I believe Davon has another question, or a question from the chat.
We have time for one more question. So after this one, Davon, we'll go ahead and close out.
Another question was, how can we overcome the denial that today's current situation is a result of blind white privilege? And how can we educate a population that is in aggressive denial?
That's a really great question. One thing, I talk about in So You Want to Talk About Race, I have a whole chapter on privilege and kind of a way to kind of build exercises around understanding privilege. It's important to, there's a couple of things I'd say. One, it's important if you're trying to talk to someone about privilege, even white privilege, that you know your own privilege before you have that conversation. If you're not willing to sit with your own, and I find oftentimes that's a real barrier to the conversation, people aren't going to take you seriously. And so, I have to recognize, like, I certainly have class privilege now as a successful writer. I have light skin privilege, I have able-bodied privilege, I have cisgender privilege. These are privileges I walk into a room with. If I don't know what that means, if I haven't been able to do the work to recognize how that privilege can make me complicit in the harm of other people, and I'm not doing that work, I don't have a leg to stand on when I'm talking to people about privilege. And so it's really, really, actually, is that term ableist? It might be. I apologize. My goodness, see? Right there. So it's important to recognize that. And then it's also really important when I'm talking about privileged people to see that the way in which we've traditionally talked about privileges is harmful. So we've talked about privilege as like these sets of benefits that people carry around with them. And what it really is a lack of systemic barriers in your path. So it means that I, like, as a light-skinned, upper middle class, able-bodied, cisgender person, can move through without some really important barriers in front of my way. Like, I could literally get into buildings other people can't get into because I can walk up and down the steps. I can, if my car breaks down, I can afford to get it fixed and it's not going to impact my ability to get to work. All of these sorts of things are privilege I move through in the day. But it doesn't mean that, if my car breaks on the side of the road, I may be able to afford to get it fixed, but it also means as a Black woman, I better hope the cops don't come by to try to see what's going on, right? And so that's a different set of barriers in front of me, different set of risks. And so when I talk to people about privilege, what I always try to make clear is that you can have that set of barriers removed, and it doesn't mean that there aren't other barriers in front of you. What it means is that you could be poor, you could be disabled, you could have all these other, systemic barriers put in front of you based on these demographics you're in. You probably wouldn't want to add the barriers put in front of Black people to those, right? And that's how race privilege works. And so when I'm explaining it to people, I explain it in that way so that they get like, these things are situational. And so a lot of times I will try to explain in that way and use my own privilege as an example. But then I would say also, that's for people who are willing to learn about it. We don't actually have to educate everyone. What we have to do is understand the way that systemic privilege works for ourselves and the people who are doing this work with us so that we can change the system. Sometimes the system just has to change, whether people are ready for it or not and are signed on. And so a lot of times when people aren't willing to recognize white privilege, it doesn't actually mean you have to get them to know what it means before you start battling the ways in which white privilege harms you in that system. And so even times where people in power don't quite get it, you can still say, all right, you know what, you may not get it, but this policy is harming us and it needs to change. And you don't actually have to get it to sign on to this change. You have to do this change, right? And I think we have to do more organizing in that way and look at it and say, you know what, if you want to take the time later, maybe I'll explain it to you, or you can read this book, or you can read this article. But in the meantime, you owe me the basic respect as someone in this system with you to say, okay, we'll make this change. And sometimes you push for the change, and then when people see the new way it works, they recognize the way it was working before. They recognize kind of what was wrong with it. But there are always going to be people who don't get it. There are always going to be people who don't want to get it because it works to their advantage to not get it. And you still have to do the work. We don't have to wait for people to catch up. And I hope that people understand that. I get a lot of questions around people of how can I make this person understand? How can I make this person understand? For over 400 years, we've been trying to make people understand. And sometimes you just have to change the system to make it all that they know. And that can be the most effective thing we can do.
I want to thank everyone today. It was a pleasure being your host. Do we have any more words that our presenters would like to share before I pass it over to Janice? Right. So I'd like to introduce Janice Degucci, excuse me. She's our director here at Neighborhood House, our executive director. So here she is.
Thank you so much, Rika. And thank you so much, Ijeoma. So we're so grateful to have you here joining us today to share your wisdom and inspiration. I want to thank Angel, Devon, and Whitney for being such great moderators, and to our interpreters, Cheryl and Lisa. Thank you to Rika for being our host, and Jasmine, Arturo, and James, and our Unapologetically Black Affinity Group for planning this event. I want to thank our sponsors, the Sheng Yen Liu Foundation and Third Place Books. We will be doing a drawing after the event, so 10 lucky attendees will receive a copy of Ijeoma's latest book, Mediocre, courtesy of Third Place Books. And I also want to acknowledge 2 elected officials that are in attendance with us today. King County Councilmember Dave Upthegrove and State Representative Tina Orwell have been on the entire conversation. We're so glad you're here engaging with this conversation, and we need your leadership to be able to make progress in disrupting racist policies. Which reminds me, commercial plug, that August 3rd is your chance to make your voice heard, to please vote. And to also please remember to vote yes on King County Proposition 1, which will continue and expand the Best Starts for Kids program. I would like to close with Ijeoma's closing statement from Mediocre. We have to have more than just the desire to fight. We have to have the bravery to look at ourselves and to see our complicity in the violence of white male supremacy. We have to not only believe that we deserve better, we have to have faith that we can do better, and we have to start now. Thank you all for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.